Alright, so the last topic we're going to discuss this week is a couple of debugging tips for you. Now, the main focus of this week is functions, but you will have plenty of time to work with functions in the lab and the programming assignment this week. This is sort of an extra helpful session. So here are some debugging tips that I hope you will find helpful as you are writing code in Python. So the first sort of tip I want to give you is sometimes when you get those highlights in idle saying, hey, there's an error here, those highlights will give you an idea of where to look, but it might not be perfect. So sometimes, for example, you might get a highlight where the code that actually has the bug is actually the line right before. So let me show you an example of what I mean by that. So here's some code that I've already pre-written. I'm going to go ahead and run it. And we have a bug, invalid syntax. Cool. Click OK, and we get this highlight. Now, sometimes the highlight isn't perfect. So sometimes if the highlight is at the beginning of a line of code, like this is right here, this is at the beginning of this line of code, the issue will actually be at the end of the previous line of code. So if we go up to the previous line of code, which is this right here, and we look at the end, we can see that we are missing a closed parentheses there. So again, first pro tip about debugging, these highlights, they give you an idea of where to look. It might not be, hey, look exactly here, and especially if it's highlighting the beginning of a line of code, it's probably an issue with the very end of the previous line of code. So now if I go ahead and save this and run it, no more bug. Cool. So that's my first debugging tip. Second debugging tip is about those red traceback messages. So if you get those messages in the shell with the red text, they might be a little bit overwhelming at first, but I promise they can actually be very helpful. So the thing you want to do with these messages is look for the last line that's mentioned in the error message, and then this will be the line where the error is in your code. So let me show you another example. So again, this is some code that I previously wrote. As you can see, this is code with 3 functions. I'm going to go ahead and run it. And ooh, look, fun error message. So this is what I'm talking about, these red traceback messages. Now, I know it might look like a lot. So what I want you to do is just look at the last part of it. So look at the last part that starts with the word file. See how there's sort of 3 parts that say file, blah, blah, blah. Look at the last part. This is going to be the most helpful part. And then look for where it mentions a line number in this last part. And right here you can see it mentions line 22. Alright, so pro tip, when you are in idle and you are looking at your code, and see my cursor is right here right now, it's on this line. So instead of actually having to count the lines manually, idle actually tells you what line you're on right here. This LN, that means a line. So that means this line right here, where the cursor currently is, that's line 8. Alright, so again, looking back at this error message, we're going to look at this bottom-most file blah 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 message. Look for the line number, line 22. Alright, so let's click around until we get to 22. This is 13, not quite there. This is 21, cool, we're almost there. So this is line 22, and again I can see that because as my cursor is on this line, it says line 22 right here. Alright, so it doesn't like something about this line of code. It specifically is mad because number is not defined. Alright, so if you get an error message that's like, hey, this variable is not defined, that usually means either you spelled this wrong or it doesn't match up or something happened. So the fix here is that here I use a parameter variable named num, and then here I use number. So I either need to change this to num or change this to number. So I'm going to go ahead and just change this to num so that these two now match up. Save it, run the code, and now our error is gone. Alright, so again, with these red traceback messages, look at the bottommost part, and then look for the line number. And then again, you can look at the line number where your mouse currently is on the cursor, where the cursor currently is, by looking right here, LN22. Now it's LN16, and so on. So that's my second pro debugging tip. Alright, the last sort of tip that I'm going to give you for debugging, and this is something that I do all the time, is just add extra print statements. Alright, so especially when you're using a lot of variables, go ahead and throw in extra print statements that are just print this variable, print that variable, so you can see what those values are as the code is running. So this is very good, especially if you're doing, a lot of math calculations and you want to figure out at what point in the code the calculation went wrong. So just add in extra print statements to see what those values are. Just be careful though, when you add those extra print statements, if they're just for debugging purposes to see what values are, make sure you remove those before you turn in your code, right? So again, you can add in extra print statements to sort of check and see what's going on internally in your code to figure out where errors may be, but just make sure if they are displaying information that is not required for the assignment, just make sure you remove those print statements before you turn in the code.